All right, we are reading Corrie tenBoom, Keeper of the Angel's Den by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are on chapter 4, titled Certain Guests. Like blood through a bandage, changes seeped across the border into Holland. The German soldiers who came into the clock shop weren't as polite as before. They asked questions and peered through open doorways. Slowly, the comforts the Dutch people enjoyed were disappearing. They were small things, inconveniences at first. The curfew kept being moved up until no one was allowed to be on the streets after 8 o'clock p.m. Each night, all windows had to be blacked out with heavy drapes so the British bombers could see no lights from the air to help them work out their position. Many of the things everyone had taken for granted disappeared from store shelves. Some things could now be purchased only on the black market, and other things not at all. Coffee became more expensive than gold, and new clothes and shoes were hard to find. Casper tenBoom could no longer afford to purchase the cigars he liked to smoke in the parlor in the evening, and Betsy cheerfully reboiled mutton bones 5 or 6 times to extract every bit of flavor from them. The store windows that were once filled with merchandise now displayed nicely wrapped empty boxes and large posters of Adolf Hitler assuring Dutch citizens that their sacrifice was going to help feed and clothe young German soldiers. Some of the Nazis' rules, though, just made the Dutch people laugh. For example, the Nazis banned all orange-colored tulips in Holland. But these were only minor hindrances compared to what was happening to the 115,000 Jewish people who lived in Holland. Slowly and relentlessly, they were being isolated from the rest of Dutch society. Store windows had signs that read, "Voor Joden verboten," for Jews forbidden. Jews were also verboten in public libraries and restaurants. Dutch Jews who held government jobs were all fired, and then all the unemployed and useless men were rounded up and sent to labor camps in eastern Holland. Already 8,000 men had been forced to leave their families, not knowing where they were going or whether they would ever be coming back. Many old and familiar Jewish businesses also suddenly shut down. One day, a merchant and his family would be serving customers. The next day, the store would be shut, and the merchant and his family would never be heard from again. Had they escaped from Holland, or had they been taken away to labor camps? No one knew for sure, and no one wanted to ask too many questions. Every week, it seemed, the Germans made a new rule for the Jews. The Jews weren't allowed to travel without permission papers. Jewish children had to attend Jewish schools. A Jew wasn't allowed to own a bicycle, use public transport, or accept a ride in a private car. Whenever German soldiers saw Jews in the street, they mocked them. Corrie expected that from the Germans, but sadly, many Dutch people were also becoming unkind to their Jewish neighbors. The Nazis formed a group in Holland called the National Socialist Bond, or NSB for short, and many Dutch people were eager to join the group. Members got the best housing, the most ration coupons, and places at the head of the line when new products arrived in stores. Petrol for cars and trucks was in short supply too, and only the German army and members of the NSB could buy it. For many Dutch people, the extra ration coupons, the housing, and the petrol seemed a fair exchange for supporting the Nazis and keeping an eye on Jewish activity. But much more scary to Corrie were those members of the NSB who truly believed that what Hitler said and wanted Holland to be a part of his master race. The war was taking some chilling turns. To everyone's surprise, in June of 1941, Hitler ordered the German army to attack the Russian army. The Russians, though, were supposed to be Germany's ally in the war. When the tenBoom family heard the news on Radio Orange of the attack, they were shocked. What kind of madman was Adolf Hitler that he would attack his allies? Like many others in Holland, they began to worry that if he could do such a thing to the Russians, what might he do to the Dutch? A strange feeling crept across Holland. No one knew whom to trust anymore or who would be the next Jewish person to disappear. Then the Germans made a new law. Whenever they were out in public, all Jews were to wear on the front of their clothes a patch bearing a large yellow Star of David with Jew stamped across it. When Casper tenBoom read of this new law in the newspaper, he put on his hat and coat. "Where are you going?" Betsy asked him as he left the house. "You will see soon enough," he said. He came back 2 hours later and laid a patch emblazoned with a yellow Star of David on the arm of his chair. "Betsy, could you sew this onto my coat, please?" he asked deliberately. Corrie and Betsy looked down at the patch and then at each other. Corrie recognized the look of horror in her sister's eyes. "No, Father," Corrie blurted it out. It won't help for you to wear this." Caspar tenBoom looked up, his bright blue eyes shining through his rimless glasses. "If it is good enough for God's chosen people to suffer, then it is good enough for me to suffer with them." Both of his daughters sat down beside him and began the long process of convincing their stubborn father that there were other, more useful ways to help the Jews, and that for now risking his arrest was not going to help anyone. Eventually he was persuaded and laid the patch with its yellow star lovingly in the pages of the family Bible. Although he never wore the patch, his daughters knew he would have done so proudly. He would not have had a second thought about suffering or even dying to help a Jewish person. Sunday, May 10th, 1942, was the second anniversary of Germany's bombing of Holland. Corrie, Betsy, and their father felt the need to get out of the house for a few hours, so they decided to visit Velsen, a nearby town where their nephew Peter played the organ at church. All of the tenBooms were musical, but Peter had a special gift and had won the position of organist ahead of 40 other applicants. Corrie was especially pleased about this because being an organist in Holland was an important job. She hoped it might protect Peter from being sent to Germany to work in a factory like many other young Dutch men. After a slower than usual train ride from Haarlem, Corrie, Betsy, and their father arrived at the Dutch Reformed Church in Velsen. The service had already begun, so they had to squeeze into the very back pew. Since the start of the occupation, churches all over Holland were fuller on Sundays than they had ever been. Sometimes a congregation would be so large it spilled out onto the street. The service followed the usual pattern: an opening hymn, then a prayer, another hymn, and then the sermon, during which the pastor made some comments, not too many, and not too strongly worded, about the occupation. Corrie understood perfectly why the caution. There were bound to be German spies planted in the congregation. As they stood to sing the last hymn, Corrie thought back to some of her brother Willem's sermons. It was a good thing he no longer delivered them on Sundays. The way he spoke about the Nazis, he would have been rounded up and imprisoned a long time ago. As the hymn finished, Corrie closed the hymnal and sat down with the rest of the congregation. But to everyone's surprise, the swell of organ music continued. Corrie gasped. Was Peter not paying attention? She hoped he would realize his mistake quickly, but he appeared not to. He kept right on playing, more loudly than before. As Corrie listened, she realized he was no longer playing the hymn. Instead, she recognized the tune of Willemus, the national anthem of Holland. Corrie put her face in her hands in horror. Everyone knew that the Germans had banned the playing and singing of the anthem months ago. While Corrie sat worrying about Peter's being arrested and thrown in jail, she felt her father beside her rising to his feet, and then she heard his clear, strong voice pick up the tune of the anthem. As though waiting for a leader, other members of the congregation rose and joined in until the whole congregation was on its feet. The rousing words and tune of Wilhelmus filled every corner of the church. It was a wonderful moment, and even Corrie was filled with pride and patriotism. But as the last refrain of the anthem faded from the pipes of the ancient organ, Corrie again worried about the price her favorite nephew would have to pay for such an act of disobedience against the Nazis. She didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, Peter was arrested and sent to prison in Amsterdam. Corrie cried for him as she cried for all of Holland's young men. She wondered what would happen to them all before the nightmare that had overtaken Holland had ended. With Peter in prison, Corrie worried that the whole family was now being watched. How long would it be before Peter's father, Flip, lost his job as school principal, or someone visited Willem and Tina to examine the records of the old folks' home? Willem had tried hard to disguise the fact that most of the people he looked after were Jewish. But it was difficult because the Dutch government had not taken seriously the threat of an attack by the Germans. It had not destroyed any official documents. When the Germans took over Holland, waiting for them were carefully detailed records of every person's political and religious beliefs. If the Germans decided to look into the records for Willem's rest home, it would be an easy matter to find enough evidence to arrest him and take him away. There wasn't much time in May or June to dwell on what had happened to Peter. Bad things were happening too quickly in Holland. Early in June, Willem came to visit the Benge. He seemed to have more reliable information about the Jewish situation than anyone else. But still, Corrie found it hard to believe what he was telling her. Was it true the Nazis had ordered all Jews to report to be shipped off to work camps? What about the old and the mentally feeble? Surely the Nazis don't want them, she asked Willem. Willem nodded. I think they have something other than work in mind for these people. They want to wipe Jews from the face of the earth. Corrie closed her eyes. The Nazis had such hatred. Where did it come from? And more important, would it ever end? 3 days after Willem's warning about what lay ahead for the Jews, Mrs. Clearmaker arrived at the clock shop. It was about 10 minutes before 8 in the evening, and she was carrying a bag and wearing what looked like 4 or 5 sets of clothes. When Corrie first opened the door, Miss Clearmaker was so scared that she could hardly speak. But after drinking a cup of weak coffee made from ground figs, she slowly began to disclose the details of her story. Her husband had already been arrested several weeks before, and her son had become a diver. Diver was the new Dutch word for a person who had gone underground to avoid being captured by the Nazis. Mrs. Clearmaker herself had been in her house when she'd seen suspicious-looking Dutch soldiers standing around the front door. In a panic, she had put on her warmest clothes, gathered a few special belongings, and fled out the back door. She was too scared to return home and wanted to know whether the tenBoom family could help her. She had nowhere else to turn. She didn't need to say any more. Caspar tenBoom may not have sewn that patch with the yellow Star of David onto his coat, but he, along with his daughters, was ready to help any Jewish person in need. He invited Mrs. Clearmaker to stay at the Benge until more permanent arrangements could be made. Within a week, the situation repeated itself. This time, there were 2 frightened people standing at the door. They were ushered into the dining room and calmed down with some hot coffee made from ground figs. As Corrie poured them a second cup of coffee, she was amazed at the composure of the 2 people in the face of such madness. Their families had lived in Holland since the 16th century, when the Inquisition had driven their forefathers from Spain and Portugal. Now they were being hunted down like dogs by a police force that had once been loyal to a peace-loving queen. It was as though they were all on the right stage, but some people were reading from the wrong script. Nor was there much time to dwell on how awful things had become in Holland. There were too many practical matters to be dealt with. The most important of these matters, and the one that needed immediate attention, was getting enough food. Instead of 3 people living at the Benge, there were now 6, and because the 3 guests were Jewish, they didn't have ration cards. The tenBooms could not grow vegetables in a garden because the Benge was on a busy corner in the center of town, and there wasn't an inch of room for a garden anywhere around it. Somehow they would have to find another way to get enough food for them all to eat. As Corrie thought about the problem, she realized she didn't know what to do. The only thing she could think of was to talk to Willem about the situation. She knew he was involved with the underground. Perhaps he had a contact who could help. The next day, she caught the train for Hilversum. As she rode along, she decided it would be best for the 3 guests to move into the country if possible. There they would be freer to move around outside. They could even help the farmers and earn their keep. Regardless of how much the Nazis asked the Dutch farmers to send to the German front, Corrie knew that the farmers would find some way to keep enough food back to feed themselves and their helpers. When Corrie arrived at Willem's rest home, she found her brother bent over a bookkeeping ledger in his office. She walked in and shut the door deliberately behind her. "I've come to discuss a particular problem," she announced. Willem raised his eyebrows. "What has my darling little sister been up to now?" he asked in a light-hearted voice, though Corrie could hear his concern underneath his laughter. "We have certain guests staying at the Benge, and we are having trouble feeding them all," she said. William caught on immediately. "How many are we talking about?" he asked. 3 at the moment, but there's nothing to say there won't be 3 more by the time I get home," Corrie replied honestly. Willem tapped his fingers onto the desk. "I have certain contacts," he said. "I think I might be able to find homes for them if they have certain ration cards." Corrie looked at her brother in shock and blurted out, "Ration cards? Of course they don't have ration cards. They're Jewish." Willem reached across the desk and laid his hand on Corrie's arm. They don't have ration cards now, but they could have them by next week, he said, more as a statement than a question. Corrie's thoughts whirled. She tried to grasp what he could possibly mean, but she couldn't. There are ways to get ration cards, Willem went on. For instance, you could steal them. His words hung in the air. Could you? Corrie finally gasped, stunned at her brother's suggestion. No, he replied gently. Every move I make is watched by the soldiers. What I meant was you, Corrie. You could steal them. 2 hours later, as she walked back down Barteljoortestraat towards the Benge, Corrie had still not recovered from the shock of her brother's suggestion. What was Willem thinking? Here she was, a 50-year-old spinster clockmaker who'd never stolen so much as a paperclip from a bank, and she was supposed to steal ration cards from under the Germans' noses? For a moment, as she hurried down the street, she wanted to yell, no! She didn't want to. Her world turned upside down like this. If she were caught, she would be sent off to a labor camp for sure, and so would Betsy and her father. They were all too old and too set in their ways for such a thing. However, by the time Corrie unlocked the side door to the Benge and let herself in, a peace had settled over her. These desperate Jewish people had come to them for refuge, and they would not be turned away. Whatever it took, wherever it led, Corrie tenBoom promised herself she would find a way to help these people.